What happens when absolute power slips into the hands of a fractured mind? Rome discovered the answer in blood and silence. Imagine execution staged as dinner entertainment, a horse draped in imperial purple, an entire city bent on its knees before a single man. That man was Gaius Caesar, remembered by history as Caligula, and for 4 years his reign became a storm of cruelty, excess, and terror that shattered the world's greatest empire from within. He laughed as senators were humiliated, he wept as gods in marble were forced to bow, and he dared to turn the Roman state itself into a stage for madness. Yet he was not born a monster. He was shaped, moulded, broken. To understand the tyrant, we start with the child raised among heroes. He was born in Antium in the summer of 12 CE, to a family already written into Rome's destiny. His father was Germanicus, the golden heir of the Julian line, celebrated across the empire as a soldier of brilliance and a paragon of Roman virtue. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was the granddaughter of Augustus himself, fierce, proud, and unbending in her loyalty to family. From his first cries, Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus was a child wrapped in prophecy, the weight of centuries already pressing on his shoulders. It was not the Senate who gave him his first name known to history. It was the soldiers. During Germanicus's campaigns along the Rhine, the infant Gaius was dressed in a miniature legionary's uniform, a child's armour and boots clinking beside the marching men. The legions adored the sight. They nicknamed him Caligula, Little Boots, a joke that became a prophecy. His childhood was theatre. Every step a performance under the gaze of thousands who cheered as though the empire's future marched at their side. This was no ordinary upbringing. Other children might play at war with sticks and stones, but Caligula was paraded as a living standard, his tiny body wrapped in the symbols of Roman conquest. Imagine a boy whose laughter echoed between rows of armoured giants, whose playroom was a campaign tent, whose bedtime lullaby was the clash of swords and the roar of soldiers swearing eternal loyalty to his father. Greatness was not an aspiration for him. It was an assignment, branded onto his very identity before he could understand its meaning. But heroes cast long shadows, and soon those shadows began to move, darkening the path of the boy who had once been Rome's darling. The first fracture came with death. In 19 CE, Germanicus, adored by legions and citizens alike, fell ill in the east. Whispers of poison clung to the air like smoke. Some blamed rivals, others hinted at the jealous malice of Emperor Tiberius himself. What is certain is that a child walked behind his father's urn in a public funeral staged as both mourning and warning. Rome wept, but within the tears lay unease. Greatness had been cut down, and greatness left behind could not be trusted. The boy's mother, Agrippina, proud and outspoken, became a threat to the throne. Tiberius's praetorian prefect, Sejanus, sharpened the knives of suspicion. One by one, Caligula's brothers were accused, exiled, erased. Their names, once shouted in triumph, were scratched from public memory. Agrippina herself was banished to a barren island, left to wither under the weight of imperial vengeance. Caligula was too young to fight, too visible to vanish. He was passed like a token of survival between imperial women, first to Livia, widow of Augustus, then to Antonia, grandmother to the future Emperor Claudius. Every step, every word, every gesture was measured under the cold eyes of surveillance. He learned to sit quietly, to hide his thoughts, to bury his grief behind a mask of composure. In Rome's new arithmetic, affection equaled weakness, loyalty equaled danger. A careless word could cost not only his life, but the lives of those he loved. What lessons does a child draw from such a world? That silence is safer than honesty, that masks are stronger than truth, that survival demands the murder of innocence long before manhood arrives. And then came Capri, an island paradise that would become a crucible of fear, where the boy's education in duplicity reached its perfection. Capri was no sanctuary. Perched on cliffs above a turquoise sea, the island gleamed like paradise, yet beneath its marble colonnades pulsed an airless court where trust was a death sentence. Here, Emperor Tiberius withdrew in old age, retreating from Rome into a labyrinth of villas, grottos, and whispered monstrosities. To outsiders, it was a palace of indulgence. To those trapped within, it was a stage of suspicion where smiles could kill. Caligula arrived as a teenager, already scarred by loss, already trained in silence. He quickly learned that survival meant mimicry. With Tiberius, moods shifted like weather. To misjudge them was to vanish overnight. Caligula mirrored the emperor's words, his gestures, his laughter, until the old man saw in him not a rival but a shadow. His mask became his shield. Executions were not rare events but background music. Courtiers fell at dinner, accused, dragged away, their screams echoing through the halls. Caligula did not flinch. He applauded when others applauded, grieved when others grieved. Empathy was traded for endurance, mercy for performance. Each day he rehearsed the art of survival in a theatre where the price of failure was death. The question of succession hung like a dagger over the court. Would Tiberius choose him? Or Gemellus, the emperor's grandson? Or would he choose neither, preferring Rome to collapse in chaos? In this deadly uncertainty, only one man, the Praetorian prefect Macro, quietly shaped the outcome. With whispers and favours, he positioned Caligula as the inevitable heir, grooming the cub while waiting for the old lion's breath to falter. When the end came, it was sudden. Tiberius's body lay cooling on Capri, and the court held its breath. The boy who had once been paraded in little boots was now crowned emperor. When word reached Rome that Tiberius was dead, the city erupted like a prison flinging open its gates. The Senate exhaled after 2 decades of suspicion, purges, and silence. The people cheered in the streets. At last, Germanicus's son would rule, the child of Rome's beloved general. The boy once carried on soldiers' shoulders. At 24, Gaius Caligula was welcomed not as a ruler but as salvation itself. His first acts confirmed the illusion. He annulled cruel taxes, recalled the exiles banished by Tiberius's paranoia, ordered the ashes of his mother and brothers brought back to Rome with honour. He showered the people with gifts, staged lavish games, and filled the city with spectacle. Senators, once cowed, found themselves courted. Soldiers received bonuses. Prisoners were freed. The empire felt, for a heartbeat, as though daylight had returned after a long eclipse. The crowds adored him. They wept at his speeches, proclaiming him the very image of Germanicus reborn. Coins were struck with his face, temples filled with offerings, and for the first time in years, laughter carried across the forum without fear. He had inherited Rome's throne, but he wore it like a festival crown, radiant and unburdened. Hope intoxicated the empire. It seemed as if youth itself had been enthroned, and with it the promise of a gentler, brighter reign. Yet hope is a fragile currency, and beneath the joy lay an unease that no one dared name aloud. Could any man live up to such expectations? Especially one shaped in the shadows of Capri? Then illness struck. Caligula fell into fever, his life hanging in the balance. Rome prayed. Rome begged the gods for his recovery. But when the fever broke, it was not the same young man who opened his eyes. It was something else. The fever left more than weakness in its wake. When Caligula rose from his sickbed, Rome rejoiced at his survival, but what returned was not the smiling saviour they had adored. He began to speak of himself as something more than human. Illness had nearly claimed him, and in surviving he claimed divinity. He dressed as gods, parading through the palace in golden beards and lightning bolts, or with the staff of Mercury in hand, demanding applause for his transformations. Statues of deities were ordered stripped of their heads and replaced with his own likeness. The palace itself was fused to the temple of Castor and Pollux, a daily reminder that emperor and god were no longer separate. Priests scrambled for favour, competing for the honour of officiating in the cult of Caligula, but his religion was theatre, and the stage required constant invention. One day he appeared as Jupiter, the next as Venus, blurring gender and divinity with deliberate provocation. Senators were forced into humiliating rituals, racing beside his chariot, kneeling before him as worshippers rather than statesmen. Laws became spectacles of control, restrictions on laughter, bans on certain foods, endless tests of obedience, designed less for governance than for humiliation. Each act deepened the chasm between emperor and empire. Rome had seen rulers elevated to godhood before, but never had a living man so aggressively demanded worship. Never had divinity been performed with such mocking excess. To question it was treason. To submit was degradation. In the glow of lamps within his gilded halls, Caligula played at being eternal, but the price of divinity was crushing. Gods require offerings, and this god's appetite would bleed Rome's coffers dry. Divinity was expensive, and Caligula spent as if Olympus itself were his purse. The treasury, fattened by Tiberius's years of restraint, vanished in less than a year. He demanded spectacles without limit, games that stretched for months, gladiators in endless rotation. He conceived marvels of engineering meant to awe and bankrupt at once. A bridge of ships lashed across the Bay of Baiae so he could ride in armour over the sea, silk sails snapping above him like a mortal Neptune commanding the waves. When the coffers ran dry, his solution was not restraint but predation. New taxes bled every corner of society, fees on lawsuits, levies on weddings, tolls on labour. Even prostitutes paid for the privilege of plying their trade. Soldiers became collectors, shaking coins from farmers, artisans and senators alike. The nobility, once shielded by wealth, found their fortunes carved open. Treason charges turned into cash machines. Estates were seized, wills forged, legacies confiscated for imperial use. And still he spent. On Lake Nemi, colossal ships floated, palaces adrift on water, their decks laid in marble, their sails dyed purple, their baths heated by concealed furnaces. They went nowhere. They existed only to dazzle, to prove that Rome's riches could be poured into the void at the whim of one man. The city groaned under the weight. Fear kept lips sealed, but resentment simmered. Caligula had transformed Rome itself into his treasury, its people into his coin, its institutions into props for his theatre of excess. And amid this orgy of consumption, one creature above all received honours that mocked the Senate, the laws, and Rome's very dignity. Among the strangest symbols of Caligula's contempt stood not a senator, not a general, but a horse. Incitatus, his prize stallion, lived with more luxury than Rome's magistrates. The animal's stable was built of marble, its manger crafted from ivory, its blankets woven with purple dye reserved for emperors. Jewelled collars hung from its neck, and slaves served it oats mixed with gold flakes as if feeding a deity. The horse dined at banquets where guests, nobles of Rome, reclined beside it as though it were an honoured peer. Musicians played, servants bowed, and Incitatus stamped its hooves on marble floors while goblets spilled with wine. It was spectacle, but it was also mockery. When Caligula threatened to make the stallion consul, the message was not jest but insult. Offices meant nothing. The Senate itself was reduced to a stage prop, its dignity annihilated by the suggestion that a beast could fill its highest chair. Historians debate the literal truth of these stories. Was Incitatus truly appointed to office, or was it theatre exaggerated by chroniclers? The answer matters less than the performance itself. For Rome, the symbolism was unmistakable. If Caligula could elevate a horse above men, then men had no value beyond his whim. This was power without restraint, contempt sharpened into spectacle. The Senate bent, the people whispered. And all understood the lesson. Rank, law, and office existed only at the emperor's pleasure, and if dignity could be mocked so easily, then life itself could be discarded with even greater ease. Power reached its most grotesque form when life itself became a prop for Caligula's amusement. Executions were staged, not as punishments, but as spectacles woven into the rhythm of his days. At feasts, a guest who displeased him might be dragged from the table and killed on the spot, while the others forced smiles through their horror. Every gesture became calculation. Grieve too little, and you appeared complicit. Grieve too much, and suspicion fell on you. The arenas became laboratories of terror. Noblemen, once accustomed to commanding legions, were armed with wooden swords and shoved into sandpits to fight for Caligula's laughter. Senators sat in the stands, only to be summoned into the blood and made to kill or die for their emperor's sport. Awnings meant to shade the crowds were withdrawn under blazing suns, so citizens roasted in their seats, unable to leave until Caligula permitted it. Even the theatre was poisoned. When an actor's performance failed to delight him, the audience paid the price. Entire sections of spectators forced into the arena, slaughtered as punishment for their lack of enthusiasm. The empire's most ancient creed, "Let them hate, so long as they fear," became his personal anthem, a razor edge that cut through every class of Roman life. Whispers replaced speech in Rome. No one trusted walls, no one trusted friends. A jest could be a death sentence. Loyalty was measured not by devotion but by silence, obedience, and survival. Terror had become the empire's language, but fear has a limit. Even in Rome, where emperors were gods and gods were men, blades remember their purpose, and soon they would be unsheathed. It ended not in a grand battle but in a narrow passageway. In 41 CE, conspirators from within the Praetorian Guard, the very men sworn to protect him, closed in as Caligula walked through a palace corridor. Blades flashed, fists struck, and the emperor who had played at godhood crumpled under a storm of knives. His cries echoed off the walls, but no rescue came. By the time the steel withdrew, the most feared man in Rome lay lifeless on the marble floor. His wife and young daughter were butchered soon after, erased to prevent any shadow of dynasty from surviving him. The Senate exulted, then hesitated, unsure whether to restore the Republic or crown another emperor. In the end, power simply shifted to Claudius, proving that Rome had not slain monarchy, only a monster. And what remains of Caligula? Historians argue, was he truly mad, poisoned by illness, warped by trauma, or merely intoxicated by power unchecked? The ledger does not absolve him. 4 years of cruelty and excess had scarred the empire. His name became less a memory than a warning label, whispered by generations whenever rulers grew too proud, too cruel, too absolute. When gods are made of men, the bill is always paid in blood,